Thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Josh and I work at X-Team where I make web apps with developers all around the world. And I'm also a CSS Modules team member. And I've been lucky to be able to introduce CSS Modules into some of our projects at X-Team. And that's led me to the experiences that I want to share with you today. This story all began for me last year at Camp JS5. It's a really excellent weekend, and I had a lot of chats with different people about how they were doing CSS. One of these people is in the room today, Mark Douglas, and I kind of watched over his shoulder as he was working on an early version of CSS Modules at the time with Tobias Koppers, the Webpack creator. And I was really impressed with what I saw there. It seemed like it was going to answer a lot of the pain points that I had felt with CSS over the years. Another person who's also here today that I talked to was Glenn Madden, and I saw a lot of the interesting techniques that he was using with CSS, kind of experimenting with a lot of things. And he went on to incorporate a lot of those ideas with CSS modules. So it felt to me like there was a lot of really cool ideas kind of converging around CSS modules, and I wanted to find out more about it. Now, at the same time as this event, I had just started a brand new front-end project with one of our clients, Bugwolf, and I bet you can guess what happened next. You know, you go to a conference, you get your head full of ideas, and then you come back to work, and it's a little bit like that. And it's always smart to exercise a bit of caution when you're trying out a brand new technology on a real project. But at this point, I didn't have to think too hard. I was pretty convinced that it was going to be a great fit for our project. And that was 18 months ago. And I can say that in the last 12 years of doing web development, this has been the most pleasant experience of working with CSS that I've ever had. So I could come here today and tell you all the things that I like about it and why it's just the best and everyone should use it. But you know, it's funny because I've also come across a lot of people who haven't been having such a good time. Thank you. Let's do that. Hello. A lot of people haven't been having such a good time with CSS modules, and you know, I've seen a lot of discussions online, people getting kind of frustrated about some of the limitations of CSS modules. Now, this is the internet, and so a lot of these frustrations kind of go along the lines of like, hey, I tried using this new hammer and it really sucks at putting screws in. And we can laugh about that and say, you know, it's not what it's made for, you know, you shouldn't do that. But some people still expect it to work, like Yahoo Answers. Thank you, Yahoo. Stay relevant, buddy. But you know, a lot of the complaints that I saw were actually really valid ones too, and I came to agree that there are a lot of things that are very difficult. Sorry, not a lot of things. Some things are very difficult to do with CSS modules. Other things are just impossible. This is where I got curious. Could it be that my pleasant experience and their frustrating experience were somehow related? Could it be that by restricting our freedom in some areas, CSS modules also opens up new and powerful ways to solve our problems that we didn't have before? So that's what I want to look into today. Now, a lot of people put up their hands before, but I'm sure there are still plenty more who are wondering at this point, what is this CSS modules thing? So I'm going to give you a very quick introduction. And here's an example of like what it looks like to use. So we've got a CSS file up here and a JavaScript file on the right. There's nothing unusual going on there. But the thing to notice about these two files is that they're both counterparts of the same UI component. We've got CSS to describe the styles and the visual aspects of the component, and we've got JavaScript to describe the structure and the logic of the component. Now, the point where CSS Modules kicks in is right here where we import the CSS file into our JavaScript. And when we do that, when we import CSS into JavaScript with CSS Modules, there's two things that happen. First of all, we get a result back from the import. We get a dictionary of class names that we can use to style our DOM elements. And the second thing that happens is when we import a CSS module, all of the CSS content that you see on the left, that's going to get included in the final output bundle that's sent to the browser. So we have everything here needed to render a UI component, and CSS Modules helps to kind of wrap it up into a single encapsulated unit, and we can use this to build up our system, our front end. And that's where the name CSS Modules comes from. Just like how we have a JavaScript module that has a self-contained scope and API based on imports and exports, it's the same thing here, just with CSS. Now, there's much more that I could say about CSS modules. This was just a very quick introduction, and we'll see some more as we go on. But you know, there's not heaps more to it. One of the things that I love about CSS modules is that it's pretty conceptually simple. And there's not, you know, once you grasp the basics, it's easy to understand what's going on. Before we do go on, the title of the talk is 6 Ways to Win with CSS Modules, and I'd like to say something about that. Why win? Well, CSS can be a bit of a battle sometimes, can't it? Like, when you start out, it's really easy. You say, make this thing red, and it goes red. It's awesome. It's so easy, it feels great. You get a good result. But then, you know, you go on, your project gets bigger, you add new features, requirements might change from what they were originally, maybe your team grows, things can start to get a little bit hairy and out of control. And, you know, at this point, yes, the house is on fire, but you can still be pretty optimistic that things are going to be okay in the end. We're going to get there. But things can get really out of control. And you can build up so much technical debt and complexity that all you can think about is, like, let's just wipe this out and start fresh. So there's that aspect of winning. We want to avoid all the complexity that's pushing us over this way and stay in that nicer left-hand side where, you know, we're still in control of things and it's feeling good. And that feeling good is, you know, I want to say it's important. Like, it's not the most important thing. It doesn't matter if we feel good about what we're doing, but, well, it does matter. It's important because you can tell the difference in any craft. You can tell the difference in the end product when people have really put their hearts into it. And so having that feeling of winning, of overcoming complexity, it's an important kind of morale boost. It's going to keep us going when things are difficult. And I think you all know this feeling. In fact, I think I can produce that feeling right now. Because nobody would ever waste their time playing solitaire if you didn't get this at the end. That is the power of the feeling of winning. And when we talk about winning, you know, another thing comes to mind, of course. An Urban Dictionary defines winning as a constant state of enjoying life. It does not end, otherwise one was not truly winning to begin with. Hence the suffix ing. Because I'm sure that you've all had that experience of using a shiny new technology, and it's great at first, and then it starts to create more problems than it solves, and then you're stuck with it. See, in those situations, you did win, but you were not winning. And we're going to need that ing if we're going to make something good that lasts and find joy just in the simple act of making it. So I want to show you today how there are 6 ways that CSS modules can help us to achieve that lofty goal. And that it can help us not just at the start of the project when things are easy, but all the way through, from authoring through to debugging and all the way through to refactoring. Now, one of the first problems that I think people come to with CSS modules is coming from that simplicity that I mentioned before, because the flip side of simplicity, of course, is that it might not have the features that you're used to if you're coming from another language. And I can tell you about one time that we ran into this problem in our project. So it was pretty early on, and we were building this nice leaderboard component here. So the leaderboard component is like the overall thing, and then a sub-component. Each of those rows was a sub-component that we called a rank. And we had the code that looked something like that. I was doing a code review with a teammate, so we're sitting down and thinking, okay, we can see there's some duplication going on here. We better fix that. So our first reaction was to rewrite it like this. So we've nested all of the other selectors under that first rank and got rid of the duplication. It's a go-to solution when you're using something like Sass or less, and it helps to sort of keep your code cleaner. But the catch is this code on the right, by default, that's not going to work with CSS modules, just like how it doesn't work with plain CSS. And so at this point, we started to think, okay, maybe we need to run this through Sass first, and then into CSS modules. And that would have worked, but before we even got to that point, we saw that there was another way we could get rid of the duplication. See that? We just deleted those extra dot ranks because we realized we didn't actually need them. And the reason they were there in the first place was just out of habit. We thought that's just how you write CSS. Because it's a really common practice in CSS to namespace your selectors like that, so that they don't get confused between one component and another. But here's the wonderful thing. CSS modules automatically namespaces your classes for you. And it does this by sort of rewriting each class name so that it's guaranteed to be globally unique. In development, we can have like a nice descriptive path to that component, so it's easy to see where it came from. In production, you can reduce that down to a smaller symbol. And so I got excited about this very simple thing way back when we were doing the project, and I still kind of am, because I think if you can improve your code by deleting some of it, while at the same time avoiding adding another tool to your stack, that's kind of winning all over the place. And we don't need more features if we can remove the underlying problem to begin with. So I want to say that's our first way to win CSS today. Don't manually namespace your classes. Let a computer do it for you. They love that stuff. Now, I talked about rewriting class names, and there's a little bit of magic going on there, right, to do that rewriting. And you might have come across a lot of CSS and JS techniques that involve a significant amount of magic, like getting hover states and media queries to work when using inline styles. That's quite a bit of magic here. So what kind of magic do we use with CSS modules? Well, the best way to see that is to compare the source code and what actually appears in the browser. And you'll see that it's pretty much only the names have changed. Everything else is, there's some auto prefix stuff at the top, but everything else is pretty much identical apart from the names. So there's only a teeny little bit of magic to rewrite those class names. And when you're using CSS modules, you're still using actual real CSS all the way through from start to finish. And I would even say that CSS modules is not exactly CSS and JS. It's more like imagine if you've got CSS land up here. JavaScript land is way down here. And you can't get between them because there's this big fiery pit. Well, with CSS modules, they're still two very separate places, but we get this nice bridge. Wow, it's fantastic. It really is. And so that's our second way to win today. CSS modules allows us to write real CSS, but with less hacks and with a nice bridge over to JavaScript land. So there's some nice simplicity about it, and it's real CSS. But you might also ask, why do we need to bring JavaScript into it? This is a CSS conference. We don't do that. Well, why can't we just use plain HTML templates? The long story is you can, but that's something to talk about another time. But I want to show you how CSS modules can make you type more, and that might feel like a problem, but we can explore that. So let's have a look at an example of using just plain HTML templates. It's the same as before, but no JavaScript. If you want to apply one of these classes to the DOM, it's really easy. You just type the name in. You don't have to mess around with importing CSS file into JavaScript and using the dictionary of class names. You just type the name and it's there. And this might seem simple on the surface, but the thing to note about this example is what we don't see. Because these two separate files are still highly dependent on each other. The fact that we're using that string root here only works if there's a corresponding one in the CSS file. We all know that. Same with avatar. We've got a mapping from heading that doesn't actually go anywhere. Maybe somebody changed the CSS but forgot to update the HTML. Who knows? But the point is, there is an API between these two files. It's just not a good one. It's completely ad hoc and unenforced, and you won't get feedback if you've done something necessarily wrong. Let's compare that to our CSS modules example. And I hope you can see that straight away we've got now an explicit mapping between the DOM and the style sheet rather than something just based on arbitrary strings. We're using properties of an object now. And we can take advantage of that in a whole lot of cool ways. For example, you could use flow type or TypeScript to tell you if you've tried to apply a class name that doesn't exist. So that's kind of awesome. And that's our third way to win CSS today, is that CSS modules allows us to have an explicit mapping between CSS and the DOM, and a tangible API that we can do a lot of cool stuff with. Now the next one is a big one. And a lot of people have run into trouble with this. It's that CSS modules will break some familiar patterns. And I've come to kind of really love this one because it's forced me to rethink a lot of my approach to how I write CSS and to learn a lot of new things. So I'll show you an example of a very common pattern in CSS, and then we can talk about why and how we're going to rethink that. So here we've got something called a label, and it's red. Easy, feels good. And then at some point later on, we're redefining the color of a label to be blue whenever it's in the context of a module. Using the cascade like this it's probably like something you learn on day one of how to do CSS, and it's so familiar, and we use it so often, that I think we sometimes forget about the cost involved. Because ask yourself this question: did the author of this code really intend to redefine the meaning of label? Or were there two separate elements both called label? So is there one label that looks different depending on where it's used? Or are there two separate things both called label? Know the answer? Neither do I. Because there's actually no way, purely at the language level, to express that intent one way or the other. Like, the best that we can do is follow a convention or leave a comment. Let's ask another question. What color is a label? It's a pretty simple question. But again, we can't answer that question until we know the entire structure of the DOM, and you also have to tell me which particular label element you're asking about before we can get an answer. So we can use the cascade like this, and it's really easy to get the effect that we want, but it comes at the cost of predictability, of being able to answer these kinds of questions just from looking in one place. Our code has become very, very context dependent. So why is this a pattern? Well, we use it a lot, well, I use it a lot when we're building components that we're going to reuse across the system. So sometimes they have to look slightly different in different places. If we go back to our leaderboard example from before, each one of those rank subcomponents has an avatar. And we know that an avatar, we're going to use that in other places in the front end as well, like in the profile settings that you see up there. But it's a different size up there. So the way that we traditionally do this is we'd have our general purpose styles in the avatar component, and then in our leaderboard component, we use a cascade rule to override some of them, the ones that we want to change. And this is the precise point at which we hit a wall when we're using CSS modules. Can't do it. Because do you remember how CSS modules rewrites the class names to be globally unique? Well, what that means is that the leaderboard component can't actually know what the class names of the avatar component are going to be. So you can't target them with a cascade. Some clever people have put some proposals forward to add features to CSS modules that would make this kind of thing possible. And that would be kind of cool. But I was thinking, and even if it were possible, I don't think I would want to use it because of the costs involved that we saw before. And I think we've got a much better way. So the key to figuring this out, I think, is to understand that what we've got here is not just styles. We've actually got some logic in our CSS. It's display logic, right? And we could write that as pseudocode, like if the avatar appears within a leaderboard, then make it smaller. I spoke before about the separation of concerns in a component, how we've got CSS for visual aspects and JavaScript for logic. So we've got display logic here that would make sense to include that in that same grouping, wouldn't it? And when we separate our concerns in that way, we end up with CSS that is much more neutral and predictable and doesn't depend on context. And we've moved the decision of whether an avatar should be big or small to the components API, rather than just giving any other component free rein to reach in and change whatever they want. And there's something else interesting that's happened here in our CSS, because remember we used to have one class avatar that could mean something different depending on where it's used. Now we've got three classes, avatar, big and small, and their meaning never ever changes, no matter what. In other words, we've made our classes immutable. We can still compose them together to get the effect that we want, but we're never going to change what they're meaning. And think about the effect that this has on your experience debugging. Whenever you see one of those names, you'll know precisely what it means without having to do all that mental gymnastics of figuring out which context are we in right now. So that is our fourth way to win CSS, is that CSS modules helps us to embrace immutability and get all the benefits of that. And it also has some great first-class support for composing those immutable classes together. Now, the next problem that we encounter, a hurdle, is not a hurdle for everyone, but for a lot of people, they'll face this point of saying, oh, I need to use a build tool now, like Browserify or Webpack. Because there is actually no runtime with CSS modules. Everything's happened at build. Now, this is kind of a whole other topic of its own, and I'm not going to dig too deep into that, but there is a pretty strong case for using tools like this. And they've fundamentally changed the way that we think about front-end code. Like, even just a few years ago, many of us were bundling our front-end assets something like this. We'd get all of our JavaScript files and concat them together. And then we got all of our CSS files and concat them together. And then maybe do something with images or SVGs or whatever. But with these modern tools, we have a much more natural way to describe a component-centric front end. So we start with an entry point, and then that has some dependencies on other modules, and then we have our UI components down here, and CSS modules is just a natural extension to that tree. So each one of these UI modules depends on some CSS that it imports. And having everything in the one tree means that we can be a lot more strategic about how we split things up, how we modularize, and it also helps our tooling to make much smarter choices about how to optimize what gets sent to the browser. So that is number 5, way to win. CSS modules allows us to give our JavaScript modules CSS dependencies and have everything in the one dependency tree. Final one for today is fork, aka the fear of removing CSS. Because if you're like me, you've been in plenty of projects where like everybody knows there's this bunch of CSS code that we don't actually need it anymore, but nobody's got the guts to remove it because it's probably going to break stuff. And so it just kind of sits there and accumulates over time. But what happens when all of our CSS is part of a dependency tree? Well, you can imagine when one of those UI components is not imported anymore, it becomes disconnected from the tree, and so the CSS module is not connected anymore either. So at that point, we can just delete the whole thing. I really, really love this, and we've come to this point a few times in our projects now, and it is a wonderful feeling just to delete a big slab of CSS. You should totally try that. That is our final way to win CSS for today. CSS modules helps us to defeat fork by writing our CSS as modules that are really easy to delete. So to wrap up, we've talked about a few of the problems and a few of the hurdles that you're going to come to if you're using CSS modules. But everything is a trade-off. And we often talk about things like, this one is good and that one is better. But I think we should really be talking about what does it cost and what do you get in return. That's the stuff that you need to know to figure out if it's going to be a good trade or not. So we've looked at some of the way that CSS modules gives us value across every stage of our project. When we're authoring, we can just write very simple class names without having to think about a global context, just stuff that makes sense for your module. And they're going to be automatically namespaced, so there'll be no collisions with other parts of the code. When we're debugging, we get the benefits of immutability, of being able to look at a class name and know, yep, I know exactly what that means without having to figure out the context. And having an explicit mapping between the DOM and the style sheet means that it's very, very easy then to trace your way back to the source of an error. And when we're refactoring, we can be strategic about how we split things up into modules and reuse components because everything is part of the same dependency tree. And as soon as a CSS module is disconnected from that tree, you can just delete it without a second thought. So those are my 6 ways to win with CSS modules, and I said at least 6 because there are just so many more that I don't have time to talk about today, but I'm sure that you're going to discover them for yourselves. And please come and chat to me afterwards if you'd like to talk more about that. So wrapping up, huge thank you to all of the CSS modules team and contributors. There's a lot of them now, and thank you for making this product that has been such a joy to use over the last 18 months for me. Thank you as well to all of the CSS Conf organisers for putting in all this hard work to get us here today. And thank you all for listening.